Mike Volpi from Index Ventures is with us. You probably know him. He helped open the San Francisco office in 2009. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, that's right.
In addition to Cockroach and Confluent, who are with us today, he's an investor in Elastic, Sonos, Zuora, Pure Storage, and some others. Mike was previously head of Cisco's routing business. And he may or may not remember this, but he was one of my first interviews when I moved out here with Bloomberg in 2006 to cover networking. So thanks for that, Mike. We have Spencer Kimball from the CEO of Cockroach Labs, which he co-founded in 2015. He was previously at Square, Google, a couple of his own startups. And for those of you that don't know, Cockroach is the company behind the CockroachDB open source database. And we have Erica Schutz, president of field operations at Confluent, where she oversees sales, business development, customer success teams across the globe. Previously chief revenue officer at New Relic, and before that, almost 17 years at Oracle. And so that I don't annihilate the description of Confluent, I'm going to let Erica give a brief description.
Sure, thanks, Ari, and great to be here with this group. I'll offer a couple comments about what Confluent does. We're in the data and infrastructure space, and we're pioneering a new category of event streaming. We offer an event streaming platform. It's built on open source Apache Kafka, and we believe Confluent can be the central nervous system of a modern digital business. A little bit of background, what is event streaming? An event is any small action that happens in the digital world. Click of a mouse, putting an item in a shopping cart, updating a bank balance, et cetera. And pre-event streaming, those events and that data is stored passively, and you have to query it and ask for it. With event streaming, that data is more fluid and it's more actively pushed into applications. And so it enables more real-time applications, which we all know are so essential right now. So in short, we're an event streaming platform based on open source Kafka.
Erica, do you want to talk a little? You just joined the company in October, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And so you quickly moved into a very different state of being. Do you want to talk about what it was like for your first couple months, and then what happened come February, March?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, right. We've all experienced quite a bit in the last 7 months. I've been so excited to join the company. I think, what drew me to it was just the proliferation of Kafka in the world, the adoption of it so broadly across so many organizations. Several 100,000 organizations are using Kafka, including a lot of Fortune 500, Global 2000 type companies. And the business that Confluent has built has been to take that open source adoption and help companies, with a more scalable and secure offering, and now a managed cloud service as a way to get Kafka and event streaming, but really help companies make it more of an architectural standard and production safe or production ready, we like to say. So over the first few months, we, pre-COVID, I guess, we were really looking at kind of studying what are our opportunities to further the growth. There's lots of, we have dominant industries like financial services and insurance and retail that we want to double down on, as well as grow into new industries and into new geographies. So we've been executing against that plan, as well as really bringing our cloud service to market, which is a relatively new service. And it's the fastest growing part of our portfolio. So we really wanted to double down on that. When COVID hit, I'm sure occurred for many of us, it really prompts us to kind of examine both the bets that we've made in terms of how to grow the business, as well as re-examine, are we aligned to the most pressing, customer challenges that we can help customers solve? And then third, is there a business model really aligned to how customers want to consume technology right now? So let me just hit on those three really briefly. First, as I mentioned, it really forced us to examine the bets that we made. And one of the biggest bets that we'd made was around really leaning into the cloud and putting more and more investment into our managed cloud service. Confluent wasn't born as a managed cloud service. That was a bet that we made a couple of years ago. But in light of COVID, we decided that that was not only the right bet, but a bet that we wanted to accelerate and put even more investment behind, allowing customers to to consume Kafka and event streaming through a fully managed cloud service where they don't have to worry about spinning up their own infrastructure and hiring full teams to manage Kafka deployments made a lot of sense for customers in this time. So we really doubled down on that bet. Second, as we all know, one of the things that happened with COVID is, many customers accelerated their, broadly speaking, digital transformation projects. And so a lot of the areas where we had already been solving customer problems like real-time customer inventory, customer 360, real-time fraud detection for banks, those things became even more important. And so again, we kind of leaned into those use cases and made sure that we had really clear value statements for customers and clear sort of total cost of ownership so that we could be one of those technology partners that kind of stays above the cut line. All customers are looking at, all right, where do I spend these days? I can only spend on a certain set of projects, and I have to make sure that those are really high priority. So we want to stay above that cut line. And then third, I would say, the other examination that we did was really looking at our business model and does our pricing and packaging, align with how customers want to consume technology today. And there, because of our cloud service, we'd made a bet to offer more pay-as-you-go and usage-based billing versus asking customers to make a big commitment upfront and forecast, what their usage might look like months from now or years from now. So that bet on pay-as-you-go and usage-based was a really smart bet for us too. It aligns much better to how customers want to partner and want to consume technology. And it's also good for us as a business because it gives us a little bit more resilience and easier decisions for customers to make, I guess, as they look to consume our technology. So it's been a lot over the last 7 months.
Yeah, that's great. Spencer, maybe you could talk a little bit about your evolution in the cloud and what has happened over the last few months that may have accelerated that transition as well.
I think a lot of the points are similar to Confluent's journey. We're, a couple of years behind them, I'd say, in terms of go-to-market. Traditionally, our business, I think like Confluent's, has just been on-premise or self-hosted is probably the right way to describe it. People run the relational database themselves, often because of InfoSec requirements. Or they're holding the crown jewels, the operational data sets. And most companies are just more familiar with that model. That's where they're coming from, especially the big companies in terms of running Oracle or SQL Server or DB2 even. So that's been our business, and it would be, I think, kind of crazy to ignore that and sort of go, head to head or toe to toe with Amazon directly in the growth segment. We have had really good luck with larger enterprises, but things are changing, and I think COVID, we've seen a remarkable increase in the appetite of bigger enterprises. Not just the smaller growth, high-tech growth companies, but these big global 2000, Fortune 500 type companies in terms of their appetite for saying, hey, well, you guys are SOC 2 compliant now. Will you be able to run this in Azure? Will you be able to run this in GCP or AWS or even across the clouds? And so that appetite has accelerated. I mean, it's unmistakable. Where 3 months ago, these things were envisioned for a future in a year or two. Now they're being actively sought after. So that has been interesting. We definitely have seen an acceleration in the whole program around replatforming for cloud native. So it's and I think like Confluent, Cockroach sort of is in that nice sweet spot in terms of being over the threshold in terms of what companies would consider to be a crucial investment for the future, something that's not necessarily going to be delayed, even if COVID's impacting their business fairly substantially. And so I think we're certainly beneficiaries of that, but we've also had to sort of take a step back in our business as well. I think similarly, and look at how, for example, we were hiring previously. We moved to an agile headcount plan instead of a strategic plan, trying to envision things we might think we need this year and plan that way instead. It's more, how can we increase the efficiency of our business during this time? And I think there was, as you grow so quickly in a company like Cockroach and Confluent, no, it's the exact same thing. You have a tendency to just sort of overhire and not really worry so much about the efficiency. just because it's this headlong rush and you're getting new investment and you're hiring all these new people. Trying to deploy all that efficiently is very difficult in the face of high growth. And COVID has provided an opportunity for us as a business to take a step back and look very critically at those processes and that growth and at the efficiency of our sales model. So I think this has been a boon fundamentally to our business, both in terms of the acceleration of demand and the market coming to us, as well as an ability to look critically at operational efficiency. And we've made some big changes there.
Interested just, to take a step back. And by the way, if you have any questions, anyone in the audience, feel free to drop it in the Q&A channel and I'll be poking in there periodically. Spencer, your view in general on selling into open source these days. You've been on both sides of the sort of selling coin with licensed software and open source. How challenging is it today relative to a few years ago, and where do you see kind of the biggest evolution right now?
Well, I'm certainly very happy we're open source. And we started Cockroach as an open source project really, and it was very clear that an open core style company back in 2015 made the most sense. Most of all because that's how I want to consume software. The idea of having something totally closed source that I can't go around and poke into it as a developer makes me very uncomfortable, and I think that's not uncommon. Open core was a very promising business model in 2015, but it suffered a lot of challenges in the intervening years, primarily from Amazon or AWS. I think Elastic and Redis Labs are two companies that I point to as having to struggle against Amazon taking their open source products and really pushing those through their platform advantage to great effect, and really siphoning off business. In some cases, that's seen as a positive because they're sort of a feeder to a more best-in-class sort of commercial offering of Elastic, for example, Elasticsearch. But it's also problematic. And the way that we built Cockroach, it became very clear that we were very susceptible to that kind of an attack. We put a lot of the smarts of the software into the core. And in one way to think of it is an analogy where you have a tree and all of the roots and the big trunk and the big branches. That's all the core, and we put all the power into the core. And the enterprise stuff was often sort of just the last little bit of implementation we put that in the enterprise license. So making it very easy for a company like Amazon, with the kind of resources Amazon has, to come along and re-implement our enterprise features, making those open source. This is what they did to Elastic, and really sort of undermining our position. Now, I actually think that there's other interesting forces at work as well, which is that I do believe many developers are not finding open source to be the most effective way to consume software. It certainly beat the idea of going through procurement and buying closed source software, and it became this incredibly dominant paradigm in the aughts because it was that much simpler, that much faster in terms of time to value of getting something stood up in an evaluation sort of situation or scenario. Nowadays, a cloud service provides a much better time to value. So that's where the next generation, and that's where the next generation of infrastructure is just going to exist from the get-go. For a company like Cockroach, we're now struggling with, okay, well, we're still in a situation where many of the world's biggest companies need to run this self-hosted, but they're increasingly moving to cloud. And all of the evaluations, I think that many developers are finding it much easier to get started with a service. So we have to figure out the way to balance that. And my personal belief is that there's a big opportunity here. Cloud consumption, cloud service consumption is definitely, I think, preferable for many developers, but I think it's too expensive. That's something that we've struggled with. In order to run Cockroach in sort of its powerful, differentiated deployment, you would run Cockroach nodes in potentially even different continents, and truly spanning the globe. And Cockroach has that capability, but the entry-level price for something like that could be thousands of dollars a month. So way out of the sort of tire-kicking evaluation range of an average developer. So really what we're seeing is, how do we change the cost structure and really think about services as being open, being across the cloud, actually being free and perpetually free for that sort of entry-level evaluation. even something like a global database, we want to make that perpetually free. And the details are interesting, but probably not germane to this discussion. But it's really pushing multi-tenancy and things like that. But our goal is like, how do you figure out the best things of open source and the open core model, which is really time to value and free, as in free beer in terms of cost, and bring that to the cloud as a service. So that's I think that's really the future of the open core model, and it just has to evolve based on pressure from Amazon and also pressure from the bottoms up in terms of what developers find to be the most efficient consumption model.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm curious what you're seeing across kind of the portfolio and across the open source ecosystem of companies that you're looking at and investing in. How much oxygen is AWS sucking out of the room, and how much are they leaving for other participants in markets that could be big enough to build independent companies?
Yeah, Ari, I'd say this is a little bit of a journey, because if you kind of look back, the origins of these big open source projects are things like Linux or MySQL. And those were really designed where a broad base of community developers, meaning not people that work for a company, added to it with a sort of central controlling body, and the open source software grew. And Amazon initially kind of started and took those, like the EC2 is based on Linux, or they have a MySQL or a Postgres offering. And that was all good. Then what happened is that as the world figured out a business model around open source, which is represented originally by some Hadoop companies, Elastic, Confluent, Cockroach, et cetera, there started to be this tension where Amazon would just take the software and host it on behalf of people. And these companies are essentially trying to really accelerate the progression of the open source software and make it sort of a hybrid model, if you will. It's partly open sourced, and it's partly obviously either closed source or at a minimum licensed very differently. That tension is creating what you're seeing in the market right now. In some sense, Amazon capitalizes on value that's created by other companies and extracts value by simply hosting it. I think inevitably what's going to happen is that licensing is going to change. It's really the only answer, and you're seeing it happen right now, which means that as open source becomes more and more of a commercial business model, the newer companies, and Spencer can talk endlessly about his license model they've adopted at Cockroach, essentially disable Amazon from using their product as a free thing that they can offer. And so all that's happening is that there is a lot of competition, especially for earlier generation open source software from Amazon. But if you look at more modern stuff and you look at 5 years from now, that's going to be harder and harder to do for Amazon. And I think what they're going to do is, sort of what they did with Mongo, which is that they're going to publish something called DocumentDB, which is, quote, API compatible with Mongo. They've basically wrote their own version of Mongo and are now competing directly with Mongo, but now with a different code base. And if you're competing with a different code base, it's fair game, right? Like everybody gets to compete. So I think what Amazon's methodologies have forced is a change in licensing methodology, which has made licenses a little more closed than they were before. And that causes some friction with, open source, sort of hardcore people, but it's a reality of the capitalistic world. And I think we're going to live with that for a while.
Erica and Spencer, are you seeing interested in what you're seeing from Microsoft and Google in general, but are you also seeing opportunities on those clouds presented by some of the, the competition that AWS represents? Are Google and Microsoft taking advantage of some of that, both with customers and with developers?
All right.
Whatever you want to hop in.
I'll hop in. I'll keep it short. I think we're not as far along as Confluence. I'm interested to hear Erica's perspective on this. We do see that Microsoft and Google are more willing to partner than AWS, but AWS does seem to be amenable to that as well. I mean, I think the way AWS seems to be run is there's lots of things that don't mind competing with each other, and so there's not sort of a party line that everyone has to get behind, which is interesting and I think promising, because I think we need to have partnerships with all the clouds. It's inevitable. I do think that Amazon is not necessarily, or AWS is not in such a monopolistic position that they can afford to, not see sort of the writing on the wall. Amazon or AWS grew up with high growth tech companies, really, and that's their segment that they've dominated in. But as the world's big companies are moving into the cloud and just en masse, and there's a big tipping point that's happened in the last couple of years, these companies don't like the vendor concentration risk of just AWS. So at AWS, I think in order for them to really say, we want you to come to us, spend your $100 million over the next 4 years, we want you to stay, they can't really be shilling products the way they used to that really encourage vendor lock-in. Instead, what they have to do is say, okay, well, we're going to offer the best of breed on AWS. And you're going to want to stay here because we're giving you all of the best software. We're not trying to tie you in and lock you into our system with proprietary stuff. You can leave, but you won't want to. So I do think that even Amazon will have to bend under that pressure, because the the size of the market for the world's big companies is going to be astounding, and is going to dwarf what the sort of growth segment represents.
Yeah, I'll second that and add to that a little bit. I mean, what we're seeing from customers is that, particularly in the enterprise space, customers are, first off, running in very hybrid environments. The bulk of enterprise workloads have yet to move to the public cloud. So most customers are going to be living in a hybrid environment for a period of time. And second, as Spencer referenced, companies want to make a bet on multiple clouds. They typically don't want all their eggs in one basket. So they're typically looking at, multiple cloud providers. And so, one of our strategies is to really excel in that hybrid and multi-cloud environment, and be that, event streaming kind of data platform across those environments. So that's really core. And then the second thing I would say is just making sure that, we recognize that, each of the major cloud vendors, for example, does have some sort of, messaging offering, and Amazon has an offering based on Kafka, but it's much different from what we offer. It's not a fully managed service. And so in addition to, we kind of view this as we have to have the best product in the market and earn customer choice. And not only through our technology, but by having the best expertise around Kafka. And so that's a big part of our value prop. Confluent does, most of the commits to Kafka open source, and we're known as having just really deep expertise at the company, which we can bring forward to our customers in a way that, companies like AWS or the other cloud providers, it's just not their specialty. So that's another area where, customers see a lot of value in partnering with us.
Yeah. And Erica, so, you've had the experience at Oracle, which is a heavy top-down sales, probably, maybe the most top-down sales among, enterprise companies. You moved to New Relic, which was known, certainly in its early days, for being very bottom-up, and selling to small groups within small companies, and then it kind of proliferating. They were one of the real pioneers in that market. Where is Confluent in that? And is that, do you think that there is an evolution going in one direction or the other?
Yeah, great question. And I would say that, New Relic really opened my eyes to this power of the organic, bottoms up kind of developer adoption, and just how powerful that is to proliferate usage and kind of make your product, begin to make it a really acceptable standard in the market. When you couple that with being able to call on and satisfy needs of, through a top-down selling motion, the needs of a CTO or a head of engineering who are looking at, okay, how do I take this thing that is proliferated in my environment and my developers love it? How do I make sure it has the right security and governance and scalability so that I can really make it a standard in my environment? When you can couple those two things effectively, it's really, really powerful. And so I saw that same opportunity with Confluent, and that's really what we're striving to balance is how do we make sure that Kafka gets really wide adoption in the market, but also that the on-ramp to Confluent through Confluent Cloud is easy, and we can kind of meet customers earlier in their development cycle, so we get more proliferation of Confluent. And then how do we also, through kind of the best of the enterprise, selling and services motions, make sure that we're meeting the needs of those stakeholders at companies who are thinking about governance and security and scalability. So marrying those two things is really, really powerful.
Spencer, how how challenging are you finding it to sell at the highest levels of big companies? How much are you even trying at this point? And how much of that is just part of your kind of long-term sales strategy?
I would say that it's not as challenging as we thought it would be when we first went to market in 2018. We weren't really sure whether Cockroach would be mature enough or what, verticals would be interested, and certainly, would Fortune 50 companies or Fortune 10 companies be interested in something like Cockroach, given their, extreme investment over the years and other databases. The amount of Oracle instances at a big bank can sometimes, it surprises me. I mean, it's in the hundreds of thousands in that cases. So, what would be the appetite in those particular, kinds of companies? And I think the answer is that Cockroach is, surprisingly interesting and topical, sort of across the board. Way more verticals than I would have thought, and certainly in some of the world's biggest companies. And the reason for that is just that the interest and the impetus around migrating to truly cloud native platforms is high. And I think that those kinds of programs are in effect and being pushed with, I think, a lot of muscle at virtually all the companies. Not all the companies in the Global 2000 by any means. Some just are, kind of in that late majority, for example. But most of them that, of course, that are even interested in Cockroach, they're pretty far along with these efforts. And Cockroach does represent a very distinct new opportunity for building cloud native applications and services. In the past, these companies have just been, as I said, very invested in Oracle, also other database technologies, but Oracle primarily. And it hasn't always been the best vendor relationship. And I think that many companies are interested in this, I think, very crucial decision point of embracing new technology. They're already doing it. They're using Kubernetes for orchestration, right? They're using Kafka all over their stack. And they're using microservices. They're replatforming, right? They're now using either one cloud with the intention of using multiple clouds, or they're already in multiple clouds, or they're hybrid. So they're embracing so much new technology. What's a database that works well there? And what's a database where they really think they're going to be able to plan for the future? What do the 2020s look like? Do you still want to be stuck with Oracle and try to pull them with you into the world of the cloud?
And a follow-up from a few minutes ago, one of our Q&A participants asked, can you elaborate more on how Cockroach managed to compete with AWS by using a different licensing model? And does that apply to other open source startups?
Oh, this is Spencer's favorite subject, so watch it.
Try to keep it short. So, we watched what happened to Elastic, and we were a little dismayed, to put it mildly. Coming from Google, our core assumption, which has proven false, was that a big company like Google or like AWS would not seek to compete directly with a smaller company that was the sort of steward of an open source project and was doing all the reinvestment into it. Because frankly, that's somewhat evil, right? You've got this small company that's really reinvesting in the open source. Amazon comes along, not only takes the open core part, which is fine, but they then start re-implementing your enterprise features and open sourcing those. So just completely stripping your business model, even though you're the ones that built the thing and are investing in it actively. Google wouldn't do that. I mean, they really wouldn't. It's just part of their internal culture. It's their values, and people do believe in the values of the company. Amazon doesn't have values that are worse or better than Google, but they obsess about the customer. And from their perspective, hey, it's good for the customer to give them, on our platform, fully integrated Cockroach or whatever, Elastic or Redis. That makes sense for them, and it makes sense for their customer. And you can see why they do it. What we decided to do is to not invent our own license. We use something that MariaDB came up with called the BSL, Business Source License. And really what this does is it gives you, think of it as a patent protection. You can sort of set the term. We set it at 3 years. So for 3 years, we have, you can set these exclusions in the license that hold for 3 years. After the 3 years, and this happens on a rolling basis, but after the 3 years, that core becomes Apache. So it leaves an open source legacy. At every release, 3 years from that release, it becomes open source, completely open source. The BSL, as we have it, for 3 years, is exactly like Apache with one exception. And that one exception is that you can't offer that Cockroach core as a database as a service to external customers in a commercial setting. So think of it as the anti-AWS RDS exclusion. So it's otherwise exactly like the Apache license. You can fork it, all the code's available. You can run it internally as a database as a service. You simply can't run it externally as a commercial database as a service for 3 years. So that gives us a 3-year window. Amazon could take a 3-year-old version of Cockroach and compete directly with us, because that would be Apache at that point in time. But we feel that 3 years it's a lot of time for how quickly the database is progressing, and so it feels like it levels the playing field. And all of our customers that actually do like the open source aspects of Cockroach have been perfectly amenable to this. In some cases, we've had to explain it to them, a little bit of confusion, but when they do understand that it does maintain the things that they want from open source, they understand why we're doing it, and they've been very supportive.
Participant question from Mike that I want to add a little bit to. The question is, how do you assess open source winners? My curiosity on top of that is, when you're doing an early stage deal versus a later, what are you looking for at like seed Series A? And then how do you assess a likely winner when you're looking at B, C, and maybe further along?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know if I can necessarily pick all winners, but I do look for certain clues when you're investing early companies that are open source. The first, which was a big lesson from my investment in Hortonworks early on, was that you definitely want all of the primary contributors to that code base to be working at the company. So if you look at Confluent J, and others who wrote a lot of the original source code are there. Obviously, Spencer wrote a big chunk of Cockroach, and he's there. So that's a sort of need to have that. Without that, it's very, very hard to catalyze a community, to kind of keep the project going in the right direction, and so forth. The second is, you've got to keep in mind that the majority of open source self-hosted users do not pay. I mean, I'd be surprised, honestly, if 10% of a user base actually pays. So it really, ultimately, if you really zoom far out, it's a bit of a freemium model that you have with open source. And in that context, since you're monetizing a smaller portion of the overall user universe, you've got to make sure that the universe is really big. So niche companies that attack, small niches, or potentially some of those niches you could, in theory, monetize at a very high level. So you could do hundreds of thousands of dollars per node. But if the market's small and you only monetize 10% of it, it's very hard. So you got to look for generally speaking, big markets. And then sort of the last clue that you're looking for is, it is easier to monetize open source projects which contain a lot of data in them, because ultimately the customer is metering how much data is inside this thing. And so if you look at it traditionally, things like databases or Kafka, which is kind of a secret database, it has a big database inside it, are the projects that tend to be easier to monetize, because the customer can just go count the number of nodes. And the larger the data set, the larger the amount of nodes, and the more they pay you. So, system of record, founders are the original authors of the code are still with the company, and very large market. It's sort of obvious about the large market, but it's particularly important. Those are sort of the general clues or hints that I look for in early stage. Late stage investing, it's pretty straightforward. You can see the metrics of the business, right? Is it growing? Is there adoption? Is there a large community out there that buys it? Are customers adopting both, as Erica talked about, bottoms up and tops down? You have all sorts of hints and clues that tells you whether the business is going well. Then it's just an issue of is the valuation worth it? But early stage is a little trickier, because you got to kind of look for these subtle hints, I think, in companies to determine whether they're worthy of an investment or not.
Have you seen examples? I mean, Hortonworks Cloudera is sort of an interesting case study in and of itself, but have you seen examples where the companies have really struggled when they've gotten later down the line and figuring out the sales strategy and the real kind of unit economics how to make it a long-term profitable business?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at Hortonworks was one of our investments, eventually merged with its competitor Cloudera. And if you look at that scenario, it had a couple of things that were challenging. One is the same open source project was essentially being supported by two companies, which became a huge price war between the two. Not only that, but it became a war about how many features can I give away in the open source domain and make my commercial features thinner and thinner and thinner, right? Basically, how much can I give away? And if you get into a competition between two parties that are both willing to give away as much as possible for market share, you get to zero at some point. There's no profitability in that business. So, you know, essentially businesses that have no ability to retain that commercialization boundary are in a tough spot. And if you have two businesses that fundamentally compete against the same 95% of the same code base, it's really tough to monetize. So you try to stay away from those things. That's why it's so important to have the authors of a particular source code project, open source project inside of the company.
Yeah, Spencer, any early case studies for you on kind of what to do and what not to do in open source?
That's a good question. I mean, we took a very different route from many open source companies that were commercialized. In most of the open core companies that are successful that I'm aware of, the open source project had gestated fairly considerably before the commercialization started. So you know, that really, I mean, to Mike's point about how you pick those early winners, that's something where I think the writing's more on the wall than it was with Cockroach. Cockroach was more of a gamble for Index and for Benchmark, some of our early investors, because we basically just had a project that had some interest in it, but it wasn't even at alpha. I mean, you could say it was alpha, I guess, but it required huge amounts of investment in R&D to get it to the point where you can credibly say, okay, this is starting to look like a true enterprise grade, production ready relational database system. You could argue that we still have some work to do to get there. And maybe in 10 years, we'll still have some work to get there. It's just a very, very, very big goal there. Of course, then we have to also educate the market, and we have to, you know, help that sort of delicate open source project start to strengthen and grow and build community and build usage. That gestation has happened on our watch and continues to happen. So, you know, I mean, I don't know if that's a huge lesson for anyone that's starting an open source company. You know, certainly it would have taken some of the risk off the table for everyone involved if we'd had more gestation before we started building the company. But I don't think there was another way to build something like Cockroach, because the amount of investment is so expensive. I mean, if we'd waited as a project for another year, 2 years, the amount that we could have done in that extra 2 years to actually build that true relational database would have been pretty minimal. I mean, that's why we took the money and you know, from our perspective, it's like we need to throw fuel onto this fire, like a lot of fuel. And then we can really build the database in the future. And I think from the only thing that made that palatable to the investors, those early investors, was, whoa, this is a really big market. In fact, you know, pre-cloud, it was the biggest market in tech. And so that's such a attractive TAM that, you know, I think they were willing to take that gamble. But you know, you just don't see you didn't see a relational database like this kind of coming out of one of the big high growth tech companies as an open source project. Spanner was built the way Google used to build software. It was totally closed source, but that's the only one that I think is comparable in terms of the capability differentiators.
You know, Ari, if I could just chime in for one thing.
Yeah.
One thing that sort of strikes me as interesting about this is, you know, 5 to 7 years ago, there weren't a lot of open source investors actually, because why would you invest in a business that gives away its core product for free? Seems reasonable. Yeah. Now there are more, and I think one of the things that's really important is that as new investors have joined, there's sort of the vanity metrics of open source, right? How many GitHub stars, how many downloads, you know, how busy is your Slack channel? You know, there's sort of like these, you know, VCs love to look for what's the clue that this thing is taking off. And I do think those metrics help to a degree. It's undeniable. But I think it's also important when you look at like what Erica was talking about early on, it's really important to understand what the heck is it that this thing is doing and why is it important, right? Like if you look at what Confluent's doing, it's interconnecting all forms and shapes of data inside your enterprise. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is like the freeway system of data inside of a corporation. Like it's going to flow everywhere. And the more data there is, the more it'll flow. And once you put a freeway system in, you don't move it anymore. So this is huge longevity, very, very critical asset. Where if you look at Cockroach, it's a relational database, for God's sake. This is the most common database on the planet. Everybody uses a relational database, and there hasn't been a new one since like 1986. And we've invented all these newfangled databases because of some of the limitations of the classical relational databases. So you look at it and you go like, okay, well, the metrics point to it, but also like the idea has to make sense. And that's where I think you sort of have to understand how enterprises build their infrastructure and why these things make sense to a degree, and why both of these awesome companies have done so well, is that the idea just makes sense, right?
Well, and just a quick follow up on that. I assume from your vantage point, the enterprise infrastructure has changed enough over the last decade where some of these things make sense now that would have thought been crazy a decade ago.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is that, enterprise infrastructure built a certain way, then the web scale hit, it exploded. And the explosion of scale essentially pointed out all the limits of classic infrastructure. So to take a case in point, in a relational database, the only way you can make a bigger one is to get a bigger disk and a faster processor. That's the only way you could do it, right? And so once you got to a scaling limit, that you just were blocked. And so all these smart people like, Jay and team at Confluent and Spencer said, wait a minute, like if we got to operate at internet scale, we need to kind of rethink how this software is built and build everything on a scale out basis. And they basically rebuilt things because the scale requirements weren't like 1 to 5, they were 1 to 100 different between pre-internet and post-internet. And that's what's created a whole new generation of enterprise infra. And so all this legacy stuff, all the traditional data warehouses, relational data messaging systems and everything has to go out the window. It just doesn't keep up with the scale that we're operating at anymore.
I'd actually add one thing to that, Mike, which is, it's part of our thesis as well, which is, scale was a huge, catalyst for reinvention of infrastructure as it existed pre-web. But I think there's a new one coming that we're fundamentally betting on for the 20s and beyond, which is this idea of truly global services. A company like Uber, like Facebook, like Netflix, like Google, all of these companies have built global data architectures. And the reason you build one is because you want to give your customers, no matter where they are, what feels like a local experience. You can't have Australian users jumping all the way to Virginia for their requests if you want to give them what feels like an instantaneous interaction with your service. So that is, at a company like Facebook, my understanding is they've spent engineering millennia, literally more than 1,000 years of engineering effort building, their distributed data architecture. So that I think is something that is going to democratize just naturally as things like Cockroach and many other kinds of systems start to really make that challenge of building something like how Netflix builds things and how Facebook builds things. Making that, really just a sequence of tools that you put together using the public cloud, right? So this will be within the grasp of every developer. And I suspect it will be simply the way that you build things. But again, all of the infrastructure has to be reimagined for this next inflection point, which is how do you really make it work when, a company wants to have customers in the EU and customers in the US and customers in Australia and customers in Japan.
Ari, if I can add a comment too, I think to Mike's point about these major architectural shifts that are happening as companies are looking to address web scale. And I think anytime you have that big kind of architectural shift, open source is such a great fit because it enables this broad adoption and broad proliferation in the market. And for these platform layers, developers and companies, they want to make bets on things that are open and popular and, widely used. And so getting that proliferation is really important. If the alternative would be, you're trying to come in top down and encourage a technology team to make a big architectural change, that's just a harder approach. So I think there's just such a great fit with, open source and these big architectural shifts.
Yeah. Erica, what's the, how challenging is it on the developer relations side? I don't know if that's a relevant COVID question or not, since the developers are probably quite disparate anyway. But curious what you're seeing there, and you know what has sort of worked and what hasn't worked.
Yeah, no, great question. And we view our developer relations function is super critical. It's just a really important element of the business, and we're revamping some of the things that we do now. But we ultimately want to have a really strong presence in the community. First and foremost, we want Kafka to be, training to be widely available so that people can get trained up and build their skill set. And, in different formats, maybe you're a tinkerer and you just want to understand what is this new thing. Maybe you have a project that you've been assigned at your company and you need a different kind of training. But being able to meet developers where they are across that broad spectrum is super important. And, I think it's a really critical element to doing what we do.
And I interested in commentary from each of you on just the kind of the financing environment. And, if I know that both Confluent and Cockroach raised large rounds recently, but just how you've changed your view on financing the business in this sort of uncertainty of today, or if you think that you have enough visibility into the rest of the year and maybe into next year to kind of be comfortable with where you are financially.
Erica, do you want to start it?
Sure. Yeah, we raised an E round a couple of months ago, and right kind of in the middle of COVID, and I would say that again, I wouldn't say that raising the money, having the money available, prompted us to, or even COVID coming, really prompted us to think totally differently than we were already thinking, in the sense that we were already really committed to, reducing our burn rate so that not only could we have, spectacular growth, but efficient growth was really important to us. It was important to us, pre-COVID, and it's important to us now. And so again, I think COVID has kind of given us that lens of re-examining the bets that we're making, to make sure that we're, really doubling down on the things that that make the most sense for us in the interest of, highest growth rate possible, but at the most efficient, highest efficiency. And I would just say that COVID and any sort of macro environment challenges, I think they, in a way, are an opportunity to make the hard decisions faster, because you kind of have that burning platform upon which to do it. So if anything, I think it's forced us to be more decisive, even more aggressive, in terms of really focusing on our growth bets.
I think we raised at around the same time, and it was probably the worst time in the last 10 years to raise. We had decided to raise before COVID hit at our last board meeting, and I don't usually rush into these things, and I kind of let them percolate. I'm trying to find exactly what additional investor I want to add to the mix, and I got caught pretty flat-footed when COVID exploded onto the scene. So that was a pretty difficult situation to be in. We considered, okay, we could wait and maybe raise, for example, now. Maybe things will get better, and they did. But we didn't know that, right? And we could not take that risk. Just like Erica, the financing, we've come to see it as a big opportunity in terms of just how we, assess our ongoing approach, how we're going to spend money, and how we're going to actually think about, what's our 3-year plan? What's our 7-year plan? These things are just exercises. In some ways, it's navel gazing, but in other ways, it's actually quite instructive. If you don't have some path to profitability, given where you currently are, I think you just don't have a bookend by which to gauge what you're actually going to do. Okay, we're going to start burning faster. Well, it's good to know, just how fast you're going to burn and what you could do instead if you really couldn't burn. And just doing all of those exercises was something that the COVID crisis absolutely allowed us to take a step back and everyone to truly engage with those what ifs. And that's something we weren't really doing, in this headlong rush for growth and all of the success and all of the problems, of course. It's just hard to, really take that time, because it doesn't seem as crushingly apparent that, you could be running into a brick wall as a business. And COVID gave us that perspective, which is, typically something that you simply can't get, no matter how much of a good intention you might have to reassess.
And Mike, sort of a two-part financing question for you. One, just interested in your view on doing a remote deal, what that's like, and you know, how active you are, and also just how much kind of FOMO you're seeing in the market around open source right now. And then secondarily, what we can expect from IPOs in the second half of the year. We're hearing of a pretty robust pipeline that, you know, if the markets keep acting what feels like irrationally to us, we could see quite a few in the second half of the year, even if like there's no live roadshow.
Yeah, I'm not going to make any comments about Spencer going public, but and I'll leave Erica out of this because the company's too big to say anything at this point. I would say, look, generally the financing climate has been a bit slow at the early stage. I think entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs, I should say, are somewhat concerned about leaving the motherships, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, because it's an uncertain climate. And so you're seeing definitely a slowdown at the seed and Series A stage. I think that for the later stage stuff like Cockroach, like Confluent, it's pretty lively. And I think fundamentally the reason it's lively is that, you know, going into COVID, people thought, oh my gosh, broad-based recession, like everything is going to be down 30%, button down the hatches, whatever. What's actually turned out, and Erica alluded to this earlier, is that there's a bifurcation in the market. There are businesses which are truly struggling and it's a painful situation. And there are businesses actually that are benefiting from this situation, right? And the average is down 15% or 20%, but no company is average. And so what you're actually finding is businesses like these ones, which are actually seeing a push from their customer base to digitize. Investors have figured that out. They're seeing the numbers show up, and they're going after these companies very proactively. So not surprisingly, for the growth stage investing and in the more exciting companies, you really are seeing a lot of interest. I mean, call it FOMO, call it whatever you want, but you are seeing a great deal of interest in these businesses. And, you know, Spencer mentioned it, but I think actually raising money at the very beginning of COVID, probably not the best idea. Had Spencer waited a little and done it now, he might have actually gotten a better valuation. But, you know, it is what it is. He's got so much money in the bank, it doesn't matter to him anymore. But on the IPO side, I think we've seen, I would say that there is a lot of investor interest in IPOs. We've seen a few successful ones, and there is a pipeline out there. Mostly the pipeline is constituted of businesses that have in fact benefited from this COVID thing. And I think you're going to see more IPOs out there. It's a little scary because we actually really don't know what the end of the tunnel exactly looks like. But directionally, I think it generally makes sense, and you're going to see the markets open up a little bit.
And do you think since Zoom went public with a virtual roadshow, and I guess Slack did it similarly, although it was a direct listing, do you think there's sort of a blueprint there for how to do it without actually meeting investors face to face?
Yeah, I think all the direct listings and the Zoom stuff has shown a blueprint. So basically, you know, management teams get on airplanes, red eyes, they fly around for 2 weeks, kill themselves to do 1 hour meetings. Now they're just going to get on one of these and talk to investors. It's probably better because both sides are more coherent. And I think that, you know, there may be, you know, one roadshow stop in New York and, you know, one in 1 or 2 other markets, but instead of doing, you know, 17 cities in 3 days, I think the roadshows will be more rational, but the IPOs will more or less look like the same thing. I think they're not going to be materially different. And the management teams will get a little more sleep.
Great. Well, we're coming up on the hour. If I were on stage, I could read the audience and see how everyone's feeling right now, but I can't. So I'll leave it to you, Mike or Spencer or Erica. Anything you guys, anything you feel like we left out that you want to close on?
Not on my end. Thanks, Ari. And great to be with this group today.
I'll make one quick comment, just the last thing that Mike was saying about the roadshows. I'm sure this is something Erica's noticed as well, but you know, we do have a top-down selling motion and increasingly a more high-velocity bottoms-up. The top-down one we thought was going to really struggle with COVID because those are direct sellers, right? They get on planes and they go and visit these customers, and they put a lot of stock in how they can build that face-to-face relationship. we've actually seen there's some really unlooked for efficiencies that have come out. Not getting on these planes, there's a lot more outbound campaigning. People are much more willing to take meetings. It's much easier to schedule them, and you don't have to do them face to face. And things like workshops, where we used to be able to get 25 people into a room. This is more for expansions of existing opportunities. We've actually had workshops where we've gotten 130 people from all over the country that work at that company in, and we have multiple SEs. Some are answering Zoom chat questions concurrently with the presenter giving their spiel. And I think the efficiency of that is probably a significant multiple of what the in-person meetings are like. So it's very interesting. We're in a brave new world.
Yeah, Ari, the only thing I want to add is I know that this open source stuff is pretty nerdy for a high grade reporter like you at CNBC. So we appreciate you paying attention to the sector. Trust me, someday you'll be happy. Just like us investors that started investing in this stuff 7-8 years ago are very happy now. I'm sure that your incredible domain knowledge in open source will serve you well as a journalist.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that day. For now, it's just enjoyment and learning from my colleague Jordan Novet, who actually understands this stuff. So I just occasionally can geek out with him when we're actually in the office. But thank you so much, guys. This was really this was fun. Thanks for inviting me, and we will see you next.
Great. Thank you.